Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is episode 12 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we have Bill Fisher from Facebook. Bill, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. I'm a software engineer at Facebook, and I'm the principal author of most of the Flux documentation.
Awesome. Thanks for coming today.
Happy to be here.
And we have a new host, a new co-host with us today from New Relic. It's Nick Niemeyer. Nick is a JavaScript nerd. Woohoo! And when he isn't at his day job as a JavaScript agent engineer at New Relic, he's helping friends with their Node projects and giving his opinions about JavaScript to unsuspecting passerbys. So welcome, Nick.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So today we're going to obviously talk about Flux. You know, Bill, you have a lot of knowledge on this, obviously. I did see some of the React team working on this as well on GitHub. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Like, what is it and how did it become a thing?
Sure. So Flux is essentially this is kind of the rest of the application that surrounds React. React is the view layer of an application, and Flux is like the data side and the data, particularly the data flow. And it's based on a unidirectional data flow, so that we keep it unidirectional to keep things well organized and clean and easily understandable. It also gives us the kind of like functional goodness, so you can think of your React components as kind of like a string of functions doing kind of like a composition of functions in a functional programming sense, and the data just simply flows right through them, and state is kept out of your view layer and into something that we call stores.
The only implementation of Flux I see is with React, so it's not nearly necessarily a framework, right? It's more of an architecture. Am I correct in that? That's
right, and it's not really there's no real formal framework that Facebook has published. It's more of a pattern that we're suggesting other people can use. There's not really that much code that's required outside of what we have open sourced in our Flux repo, and that's just like a simple dispatcher. Other than that, you can use event emitter from Node, or you can use or from Bower, and really there's no other framework there.
And how is it different from like functional programming or data flow programming, as I've heard it compared to, as far as in principles?
In principles, it's pretty similar to data flow programming. There's also a lot of similarities between Flux and what I believe is called the CQRS pattern, which stands for like command query response segregation or something like that. But that is essentially, it's like this flow where there's a separation out between the commands of when you want to do something, and that would be like the actions in Flux, and the querying, which is like when your view layer queries for the data layer for that data after it's changed. So very similar to CQRS in some ways. I think it's similar to. I know that it's pretty similar to data flow in the sense that in data flow there is this restriction of the number of inputs on any object. They want things to be very defined in very specific inputs and outputs, and that's very similar also to the way Flux works. Like our stores, there's only one input into the store, and that is the action. The action comes in through the dispatcher, and there's no setters, right? It's like at one point.
It's an interesting concept too, because it's not. I don't think it's at its core pieces. It's not really a new concept, but it's something that hasn't been done in a while, because we have, as far as we have MVC, MVVM, and all these other MVCs like frameworks and architectures as well. So, have you at Facebook? I'm sure you've encountered stuff. I saw the video that you have on the website for React, where you talk about the chat application. Not you, but Facebook talks about the chat application and the problems they had with MVC. What were the problems that you really faced that led you to kind of go to this unidirectional flow?
Yeah, so I think that you're referring to the talk by Jing Chen,
yes.
Who was the actual main architect behind Flux. And she was working on Messenger, our chat application. and to solve the problem of derived data between different places in the application, where some like data store or model in one area needed to be updated first, so that then another model could retrieve that data from that first model. And that kind of cascading updates can, in a very large application, can turn into a big tangled web. And we wanted to clear up that web and make sure that these cascading updates between models were no longer a problem, and we could manage them much better. And the idea there is that we don't want, so there's an inversion of control going on with the stores. The stores never do anything to each other. They can only get data from each other, and they can declaratively say, I want to wait for this other store to update, and now I can get the data from that. Everybody updates at the same time, and an update has to complete entirely before the application can move on.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Can we go through like the main parts of the Flux architecture, like how you would see an application interacting? Like I'm a user, I click on something, and then how do these parts work together?
So there's a number of different ways of like getting a mental model around this thing. The core flow starts with an action, and that's just a object literal, and an action has a type inside of it. And that action comes, now that can come from a user action, like clicking on a button, for example, or it can come from the callback to an XHR call, or it can come from any number of different places. And but primarily, let's think of the button example. So you click on a button, and in your event handler, you say, okay, create this action and give it to the dispatcher. The dispatcher dispatches that action to all the stores. All the stores will hear this action. That's why it's important to have a type in that action, so that the store themselves, when they get that action from the dispatcher, they can say, is this action something I'm interested in? If it's not something I'm interested in, then I'll use that to inform how I'm going to update myself. Right? It's important to understand that the action is not updating the store is actually updating itself. And then once the store updates itself, the various stores update themselves, they fire off change events. And any of the top-level React components that are listening to stores can respond to that change event in a particular store and say, okay, now it's time to re-render myself and all of my children. So in that way, there's kind of like a cyclic flux going on, or a flux cycle, where you click a button in a view, for example, that fires off an action, it goes up to the dispatcher disperses it throughout the stores update themselves, and then the views that are interested in those stores query for the new data and re-render. And that's basically the whole cycle.
And the dispatcher too is, it's like for lack of a better term, like a single point of failure in some cases, but it's interesting, you don't have it, maybe we could talk about that first, like, is it a single point of failure or, potential?
Well, I would say a single point of awesomeness myself, but it's not. So it's a single point by which all data flows through the application, okay. And it's that on purpose. We don't want any data flow going through the application that isn't going through the dispatcher.
Oh, totally. I do like it. I went through the code base for Flux, and I was looking through how you're handling it, and you're using something called Invariant from the I think it's React that you're using it from, and Chromium and some other pieces.
Yeah. Invariant is just a method that allows us to sort of like throw errors. It's like a shorthand for like, I need to make sure something's true, and if it's not true, put something in the console, as an error. And so Invariant helps us do things like, as you're going along, when you're writing your application, if you create a circular dependency between stores, like one store waits for, like store A waits for store B, waits for store A, our invariant call in there inside the dispatcher will say, hey, wait a second, developer, you've just messed up. Look again at what you're trying to do here. And so that's what invariant is used for in the dispatcher.
Yeah, I would imagine you'd need strict error handling in that case to make it the center place of awesomeness. Yeah. As far as the data that you're deriving data, right? So what's the difference between that and explicit data you mentioned before?
Oh, okay. So, derived data is just data that's coming from another place, right? You need to, something else is doing some heavy lifting, and you just simply need to get that before you can do some heavy lifting in another store, right? So that's all I'm really talking about there. In terms of explicit data, or like the data that's more native to a certain store, that's easier to handle because you receive the action and you manipulate the data right in there. Typically, you keep that data in a private variable inside of the closure of the module, and then just expose the getters out to the views that are interested in how you want people to get the data out of it.
Do you recommend using Flux like if you're doing just new projects, or do you recommend like going back to old MVC and changing the way you're structuring everything?
Right. So this is a good question. I mean, for little tiny I mean, I love using Flux, and I feel like I always know where to begin. I always know where to be working at any given time, and it feels really comfortable. But in terms of like wanting to write the most micro-optimized, tiniest application in the world, like Flux isn't probably going to give that to you. I mean, it's not that bad in terms of size, but like I think of it like many people talk about the engines of Hondas, right? Like Hondas are great engines, really well designed, but to fix anything in a Honda, you have to pull the engine apart entirely to get to anything. Whereas the engine of like maybe an old Ford truck, it's like it's a lot easier to get to everything and to make a change if you need to make a change. But it's not what you want if you're trying to make like the most compact little thing in the world, right?
Yeah.
So I would
agree.
say, but the thing is that small applications tend to grow over time into big applications. That's why starting with Flux, even if you have a small application, if it gets to the point where your application is more complex than you had expected at the outset, which is like pretty much, that often happens, right? Then Flux is ready to handle that complexity. And so that's why we've used Flux to grow all of our applications here, and they've scaled up to like, it's scaled up to like, huge applications with hundreds of thousands of lines of code.
Yeah, Facebook doesn't have any applications that support more than a few thousand users. Come on.
I have used it on little tiny widgets, like little tiny things, little things that had to get in the corner of a page or something like that.
No, I mean you guys are dealing with large scale every day, so it's a
Yeah,
very exciting project.
Yeah, so I mean, it's both. I mean, it's worked for me for small stuff, although maybe it could have, somebody could have like, it's like decoupling. Do you need to decouple in your application? I would think that like most of the time you probably want to decouple, right? But you could write something that's a lot more compact if things are really tightly coupled, right? Yeah. So it's similar to that.
So these concepts for in Flux, since they're in the browser, do you find that the benefits of using React with its view layer with the virtual DOM, and do you think that this is necessary to get the performance and speed you would need out of this type of architecture in a browser, or do you feel like that it doesn't matter? You could use it with web components and have a dispatcher as a component, let's say.
Absolutely, it's just a pattern, and the parts of Flux, some of the parts of Flux wouldn't be quite as attractive, I think, without React. For example, like the fact that you would literally just fire off these change events and have everything just query at that point and to act upon that. What's great about React is that we're free to re-render, tell React to re-render, right, at any given moment. And React will handle that and batch those updates in a way that's really efficient. Without that batching of the updates, you have to be a little bit more careful, I think, about like what you're doing when you fire off that change event to the view layer. Certainly would be possible. I could imagine a situation like, for example, using a canvas where you wanted to just maintain the changes of your application state, the Flux pattern, and you were going to be firing off an update to the canvas with every request animation frame. So inside the store, you have a little request animation frame firing off like a change event, no matter what, all the time. And as your application state changes, then that would change the data that your canvas is then retrieving from the stores, and that would probably work fine. It's just a matter of like what's going to happen when that view layer receives that change event. Mm-hmm. Is it free to be able to do what it needs to do at that moment? Because the Flux assumes that your view layer is able to update with the new data at any given moment, right? Like React can.
Right.
If that's not going to be possible in your view layer because of some kind of performance bottleneck, like the DOM, for example, then some of this may not work quite as well. I've been curious about the web components, and particularly around that new library that Addy mentioned in his article.
Yeah.
He talked about putting together React web components.
It has React elements, I think.
Yeah, so it's like a wrapper around those elements, and I'm curious as to like what kind of performance impacts that might have.
Right.
I don't know that is going to be quite as performant as using straight React or not, but it would be really cool if that worked.
Yeah, it seemed like it was wrapping the component, or it was wrapping, React class inside that component and sort of syncing them together, if I saw that right.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd really like to see performance too, like you said, some benchmarks on that.
Yeah, and so that's been one of the big sticking points for web components is that, because it's using the DOM itself, and there are performance bottlenecks.
Do you think that would improve though, based on like object.observe and the mutation observers once we let go of some of the legacy browsers that don't support that, or do you think it'll still be a bottleneck?
I don't know that JavaScript and object.observe is going to be able to solve that problem. I think it has more to do with the render tree,
right,
and how the browsers actually work to do their rendering. And custom components, or custom elements, I think they're called, in the web component standard, are going to, until the DOM gets fixed, or there is something like the virtual DOM implemented in browsers, is going to have a difficult time rendering as quickly as we would need.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea to have virtual DOM inside the browser.
Yeah, I would love to see that. If they were to implement that in C and put it right in the browsers, that'd be awesome.
And Nick, you've done some work with browsers, and you understand the render tree a little bit from what I remember. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think about that?
Well, quite honestly, most of the stuff I do is non-rendering stuff.
Okay.
But I have done some visualizations in React and stuff, and I mean, as far as rendering, I think the way for that to get sped up is for people to use the new stuff and have those pain points and complain at the browser folks, and they tend to optimize the paths with the noisy developers on them.
Yes, everybody, if you're on the Chromium or the Firefox bugs, please star them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, maybe we should put in a feature request for something like this. That'd be pretty cool.
I have heard that there is something called the box tree that's being proposed over in the Chrome group that is like a lower level API than the DOM for rendering. It'd be almost like a canvas for rendering to the page. And I'm not sure where that's going, but that could be the path forward. There were some people from Google that came over and met with the Facebook folks about this, and they were mentioning that this was something that they were thinking about. The box tree as well.
A much lower level, much simpler API would be a lot easier for them to optimize as well.
Do you think it would be a problem syncing them at all? Like slower or fast?
I don't know. I mean, if we can get rid of the DOM, then we've alleviated a big part of our problems, right? But in terms of like making sure that it's still accessible and all these things that we'd want to preserve, I'm not really sure how that is going to work. Pretty much, it's kind of stepping outside of like things I think.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Yeah. So the views and controller views, how do they integrate with the dispatcher in Flux?
Well, the controller views, we call them that because they're the ones that are listening for the data updates from the stores. And so like we gave them that name because people are used to an MVC paradigm. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that controllers do in an MVC pattern is that they take data from the models and they give it to the views. They do other things other than that as well. But that is sort of the role of these particular components. They're still views themselves, but they are listening to the stores, and so whenever the stores fire off their change event, they retrieve that data and pass it down to their children. So you might have a few of these at the kind of the top level of your tree. You might have just one, or you might have, like, I believe the Ohm framework does something very similar, but it only has one entry point at the very top of the tree. Ohm is using React under the hood as well, but it's written in Clojure. So they only have one entry point to the whole tree. But in Flux, we've said, you can put various different entry points. I like to keep them all like basically at the top, because it helps me manage the data flow, and I understand how things are flowing through the tree at that point. So I might have one at the very top, and then maybe like a few others like directly as children of that first one, as long as I can manage the difference between those two layers. But then at that point, some people will try to put a controller view deep in the tree, because it does offer some amount of encapsulation of a certain set of data, right, and all the components that are concerned with that data. Otherwise, you're passing down data through components that really are not concerned with that.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. If like when you hit a second or a third controller view, can you access the children within that tier, or is it encapsulated?
So as far as rendering, you will, and you can pass down the props. But this is the problem with the deeply nested controller view, is that now you have kind of like two entry points into that data flow, and you have two things that may be causing a re-rendering, two data flows, that is. And that, while acceptable, does start to become more difficult to debug. And I've been in that situation with an application here at Facebook where we were opting to do that because it did offer that encapsulation, like I said, but it was a lot more difficult to debug. And so since that time, I've really tried to keep everything towards the top.
Do you think the debuggability of having the single flow is worth the sort of kludging of passing unused data through your component hierarchy?
I mean, that is a trade-off, right? You're going to have to decide probably in a specific case-by-case basis. It is easy to convert an existing tree to have a listening component deeper in the tree. But what I do typically is that I will have a prop that is like an object that encapsulates that, and I'm just passing that one prop down through the whole tree. And as far as type checking that object, that can be available through we have some new type checking in the prop types for React components that are called shape, like the shape, or you can say and you can declare what the various points within this object, what those types need to be. So that each property of the object can have its own type checking as well.
That's very cool. I usually just run without type checks and hope that that I'm doing that at the source, that I've purified it before it gets into the React tree.
Yeah, it can be a good sanity check to make sure that everything is of the right type, and can help you catch errors.
Yeah, for sure.
So anyway, that's some really good stuff. If you open up, there's not a lot of documentation on the prop types, but if you open up React prop types in the React core, it's all right there, like all the different things that you can declare for the prop types, like string, objects, array, whatever, but also these other kind of cooler ones like shape.
Cool, I'll definitely check that out.
As far as the stores, from what I can see, the dispatcher sends everything out, right? And like all the payloads get sent out, right? Is it like everything's all at once? So
yes. So it is kind of like a wide broadcast. There's no focused broadcast, and that's a good thing in my opinion, because that way it forces you to keep each part of your application isolated from each other. Like for example, the stores, they're like their own self-contained universe, ideally, right? They might need to get some data from another store, but other than that, they're totally in control of themselves. The dispatcher, likewise, doesn't really know anything about the stores. It gets these callbacks registered with it from the stores, and just knows, oh, here I've got a set of callbacks that I have to fire. That's all I know. And the views themselves, they know nothing about the stores other than the fact that when that change event fires, they have to retrieve. They've got some getters that they need to retrieve some data from. Other than that, everything is completely decoupled. So the wide dispersal that the dispatcher does kind of preserves that. Now you could say, well, that's really noisy. Like my callbacks from in my stores are getting called all the time. Well, it's really, and people are really concerned that that's a synchronous process as well. The dispatcher synchronously iterates over the callbacks to make sure they all get called. Really, in practice, I've never really hit a performance bottleneck there.
Well, you're also using virtual DOM, right? Because you're having the events are really an event emitter, so it's in JavaScript, right? If you were using something like custom events and you were dispatching events, you might have issues with bubbling or things like that.
That's true, and you don't know in events, in an evented model, you don't really know which handlers are going to handle something in what order. There's no real guarantee.
Yeah.
And so by using a callback-based system, we have that guarantee in place.
The unidirectional flow with the synchronous code sort of goes like against what we've been saying. Everything needs to be asynchronous for a long time. Do you recommend certain tools like promises or ways to handle asynchronous behavior?
I was really interested in asynchronous dispatchers. There is there are a number of other implementations out in the world where people feel strongly about that. There's a library called Reflux, which is, I'm not sure, and the things that does use that. The thing is about that is that we haven't used those here at Facebook, and so we can't really completely endorse them. We don't really know how they'll scale. We have some pretty specific reasons why we need those things to be synchronous, in that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, for one, we need to have that assurance that with the wait fors, that we will get alerted when things have a circular dependency, and that's difficult to guarantee with promises. I did write a promise-based dispatcher when I first wrote the to-do MVC implementation, and we hadn't yet open-sourced the dispatcher. And so to get around that, there was some legal stuff I had to take care of, and to get around that, to get it out the door, I just wrote this really simple promise-based one. And so, that's okay, but it isn't, like I said, it's very difficult to detect those circular dependencies within a promise paradigm. So that's one of the reasons why we have to maintain synchronous stuff. The other reason, I believe, somebody mentioned to me recently, is there's something about controlled inputs in Flux, in React, that for whatever reason, those need to be, we need to have more assurance as far as getting that data through the system, and those as well might be one reason why it has to be synchronous. But I probably need to verify that one.
So how do you achieve the performance with the synchronous code then?
Like I said, it's not really that bad for performance. You have a switch statement in each store, which is a highly performant mechanism for code flow. And it's a simple, and how many stores are you going to have in the application? Let's say you have 20 stores. You're going to have 20 of these switch statements that may have their own set of things that they're interested in or not. Not everybody's going to be interested in a particular action, and you're going to get through those switch statements pretty quickly, and that'll be it, right? And no further action is necessary. The one store, the two stores that are going to be responding to any particular action can then operate on that stuff and then fire off their change event. At that point, once the change event is fired, then you are in an asynchronous paradigm.
Have you seen those switch statements, get out of control, or as far as I have 20 things in a switch statement?
I've seen some really big switch statements for sure, but generally I'm not seeing more than maybe 15 actions in a particular switch statement. And there is a point at which you're like, okay, well, what is the domain of this store? Am I trying to do too much here? Right? Is it time to split this store up into two separate stores? But in terms of the sum total of all this potential cases in an application, I'm sure I've been in applications here at Facebook that have had hundreds of cases.
I would imagine it forces you to really look at your stores and say, okay, I need to really make these smaller, right? And more they just deal with this one thing rather than have a few large stores.
I don't know if that's true. Stores, ideally, like I said, they encapsulate a domain within your application.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that's related to that domain should be in that store. So for example, let's say you have an application where you're picking images. You have an image picker, right, as a main part of this thing that you're building. Everything related to images should probably be in one store. Everything that's like related to like what images have you selected, what images like have you, like what are the different types of images maybe. It can be. I'm building an application right now where it's like it's built out of like photo posts and just like text-based posts and also like check-ins, and I'm just putting it all in one store. It's the content items store, and because all of those things are in this application I'm building right now, those things are all like essentially the same thing. They're all being operated on in the same way. We need to manage them together, and so everything that's related to those things should probably be in one store. Now, if I get to a point where I realize, the image, the photo posts are really different from the check-ins. Like I really have to, I'm doing a lot of different stuff here. Then I'm realizing, okay, maybe it's time now to split this store into two different things because I'm really managing two domains. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you'd probably have a very, very large file, but it would be easy to read and follow, you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, typically, the stores themselves, outside of I typically write in a way, because they're singletons, I write in a way where I use a lot of private methods, and then the store itself is just like a collection of getters and the registered callback, and that's it. Everything else is like private in the module, all the application logic, private in these private methods in the module.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do you deal with synchronizing data, through something like Google Drive or Dropbox or even local storage?
Oh, like API calls and stuff like that, or syncing with local storage. Okay, so typically,
some persistent data somewhere, yeah.
Sure. So again, like the data flow for Flux is basically a sequence of four things. It's the action, the creation of that action, the dispatcher and the dispatch process, the store, and then the views. As long as you keep that sequence in place, you can pretty much do whatever you want. It's a matter of like when new data comes into the system, it has to be going through the system in an action. So you can call for new data anywhere you want. Mm-hmm. Typically, we call for new data. Like if a person clicks a button and we need to retrieve new data, we'll do it straight out of what we call the action creator methods. The things that are actually like a little library of like, user clicked button. Like that method, user clicked button, will call into like an API utils file, and that API utils file will go off and get the new data. The important thing, but in some applications, you might need to do something in the store before you fire off that request for data, and that's fine to fire it out of the store. What's the most important is in the callback. When it comes back into the application, it has to go through the actions, through the dispatcher, and then into the store, right? Rather than coming back directly into the store. And that, if you come back directly into the store, you've kind of like you've messed up the singular data flow.
No,
does that make sense?
That makes total sense. Yeah, that's where you started in the first place. So
one of the advantages of this one-way data flow is that it eliminates cascading changes. You don't end up just wrecking everything out with changes cascading through your application and updating the DOM at each step. But sometimes you need to do a sequence of actions, like one thing has to complete before the next happens. Is there any kind of like workflow hooks into the React or the Flux cycle?
So I think that oftentimes when a person is trying to get like an action within an action going on, they're trying to create an action within a store, right? They're saying a store is doing something, and they've said, oh, like now I need to fire off an action and shove this new data through the system. The solution to that pattern is actually to step it back out to the original action and let whatever needs to be informed of that store's new data to simply wait for that store and get it. Does that make sense? So that's oftentimes with like dispatch within a dispatch errors. That's the solution, is to take it step it back out to the original action that caused it, have the second store listen to that same action, and then wait for the first store.
Okay.
And get that data once it's updated. The one problem some people have told me they've run into is that they sometimes are in a, with an asynchronous callback to an XHR, that they come back and they fire off an action while there's another action going on. Like, like just once in a million chance, like it came back at the wrong time, right? And I don't have a great solution for that, like just out of my pocket. What I have seen is some proposals here at Facebook and talked about in theory of creating an action queue that you would be able to essentially put something on the queue, and once the dispatch cycle is completed, then you would take the next one off the queue and shove it to the dispatcher again. So you'd still have a series of actions lined up. They'd be happening one after another, but you'd be able to absorb them and then fire them through when it was time.
Yeah, that sounds like the solution to kind of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, but the danger there is not to do what I was trying to describe, right? Like the anti-pattern is to create an action within the store, right? That's not the correct solution, and I think once you have that action queue, it's very tempting to just do that. Just use that action queue for whatever you would need. And then you're in a situation where you're just doing all that cascading constantly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I actually thought the dispatcher was doing that, like just queuing everything up, but it sounds like it's not.
Well, in the sense that the stores are firing off their callbacks in sequence, but no, it's more just like one action at a time. It's a fire and forget thing. You know that once the action goes off, everybody's touched.
Yeah, that's kind of what I saw, was you have this is dispatching variable that will prevent something from going until that's actually false, right? And then the next one will go.
Mm-hmm. So
do you know, are there, like you said, what was the one you said that you haven't tested at Facebook? There's a framework.
Reflux is one that's getting a lot of maintenance. It has an author that's really active. Another good one is Fluxor. That was like the first one I think that I saw written, and that also has a very active maintainer. Another one that I thought was a very good implementation because it used immutable data is Fluxy. So of the three, those are the three that I have seen that I've been the most impressed with. There are many others though. There's one called DeLorean, I think, and a few others.
Are they all JavaScript, or are they different languages, or?
All of those are JavaScript. Yeah, I think DeLorean might be CoffeeScript.
So essentially JavaScript.
Yeah.
Okay, and the test. How do you do testing in Flux? Like, how do you recommend, I guess, for applications? Like, you have a chat example there. Are you testing in that?
It's interesting you should ask. There is actually a new blog post going out today about testing Flux stores. We test it with Jest, our testing framework, which is based on Jasmine. So Jest, the main benefit is it does auto mocking. So every object in your application is automatically mocked in a Jest testing framework. So then, when you're testing, you can declaratively say, don't mock like the to-do store, right? And then everything is mocked except for the to-do store, and then you have a good testing environment to test just the to-do store in isolation. The trick is that you don't have access to the registered callback, right? You would think, how am I going to get an action through the dispatcher? And because I have only this one point in the store where I can get in, right? Yeah. But what you can do is Jest allows you to get all of the calls that have been made to a particular mocked method. So you can say right there in your test, you can get a reference to the callback by referring to the register method on the dispatcher, and then saying, give me the calls for that. Give me the first call and the first argument to that method, and and the result of that is the callback. Then you can use the callback throughout your application to shove like actions through and then test with the getters after them. Does that make sense? A little bit. There is a blog post that will explain all that, and there will be like code examples. But basically the idea is you need to get a reference to the callback, and then you can do what you want. You can also mock out like custom stuff. Like let's say you need to get data from a second store inside your store. You can mock out the response to that getter on the second store and say of that method call from the second store is X, and that way you kind of like you sort of like describe the state of your application, and then you can do your testing. You can describe the state of your application through those two ways, through the callback and through mocking the getters on related stores.
And can you test the actions and the can you test the dispatcher? Like, would you?
Well, the dispatcher, it's like a unit of its own, and it has its own testing suite, which I'm not sure if it's in the repo or not. But there are tests for the dispatcher. It's like a working piece of code that doesn't necessarily need to be tested by you, the user of that module. Mm-hmm. But for actions and for other utility methods, those are simple like stateless methods that should be pretty easy to test out using any JavaScript framework, any testing framework you want. You wouldn't have to use Jest for that.
And Jest runs in the browsers, I'm assuming?
It actually runs on the command line.
So you use WebKit or?
No, it uses Node.
How do you handle like stuff like where you need to test end to end, like in a browser, to see if IE9 works, let's say, or IE10?
So we do at Facebook. We have some WebDriver tests. But we have found those to be really fragile and brittle. Yeah. React has its own React test utils, which are available as an add-on to React. But typically, honestly, I test the view layer through like actual like loading it into the browser and clicking through stuff more than I do like create formal tests for it. I feel like it's more important to get formal tests around the application logic than it is to. And if I've created my React application correctly, the data should just be flowing through React in a stateless way, and that's easy to test, right?
So does your QA team over at Facebook, do they handle those kind of cases where they go into each browser and just see?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's on the developers too to do that too, but because Facebook doesn't believe in a lot of like huge QA. We kind of like are expected to do it ourselves here, and but there will be So we do like open up all those browsers, click through them, and make sure things are rendering correctly. But typically, I mean, like I said, like React is kind of like it's been tested. It's pretty trustworthy, unless it's like a CSS rendering problem. Yeah. If you've got a test suite on your stores, you're pretty good to go.
Yeah. Just use Huxley, right, for the CSS testing.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
So.
And benchmarking, have you tried this out? Because I didn't actually load the example apps, so I don't know how they work. But do you have benchmarks for Flux?
I don't have benchmarks for Flux that I can quote to you. I can tell you though that I've done 60 frames a second animation stuff Flux, similar to the way I described the canvas thing that I was talking about earlier. I did it in React instead, and we had no problems with it. People were like, what it was the if you remember the look back videos. My team built the look back video editor where you could swap out the images that were going to wind up in your video, and we had to have this animation at the top of that editor to show you what it would look like, and so we had to simulate the video and we did it all in React, and so. We had like this ticker firing off updates out of what we called the time store, and then the Flux part, with the dispatch was just like, what images are we showing, and we were able to swap out images like on the fly while the animation is running, and Flux handled it no problem. So that's the only example I have of like something where I was like, is it going to be able to handle this? And yeah, it handled it no problem actually. So I'd love to see a really super intensive, like somebody should implement like a video game or something in Flux, something where there would be a lot of intense computation going on. I'd love to see where it hits the wall because I haven't found it yet.
Yeah. So have you seen a lot of other projects out there that are starting to play with Flux or use it in production?
I have. Well, Yahoo Mail is switching over to Flux and React entirely, and Brackets as well is moving into React and Flux. React and Flux is being utilized, or at least React I know is being utilized in a lot of companies, but it feels like just about every day I hear about somebody saying like, oh, we're going to rewrite everything in Flux because it's a lot cleaner. And so there are a lot of people doing it. I would definitely check out the Yahoo Flux work that they're doing on GitHub because they have open sourced a lot of their stuff, and it's slightly different, and it's interesting to see a different take on it. They met with us at Facebook and consulted with us, and wanted to find out about how more deeper details about some things, and so we got to know a little bit about what they were doing. And so like they've taken on a good implementation of routing, and they have their own dispatcher implementation as well. So definitely something to like examine and see the differences within.
Has there been any crazy out there implementations that you were like, wow, that's super crazy or super awesome? I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, the Reflux one is pretty crazy. I mean, it's like, I'm not sure if it works or not, like I said, but it's like it dispenses with the dispatcher and it makes the actions themselves into what the author is calling functors. But I'm not really sure if they're real functors or not. But they essentially they're in charge of managing their own like lifespan. So it's a really interesting. It's a very different take, and it's a very interesting thing. I think it's also an interesting thing to examine.
That's awesome. They just removed one of the most important pieces of the framework.
Yeah, this is why I'm not sure about it. But it's a very interesting experiment, and like I said, it's a very active project.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to see that though. I'm sure, like somebody using something that you built or you came up with or you worked with, even that they've changed it and made it their own.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of putting it out there as a pattern instead of like saying this is our framework, right? Is that now there can be a little bit of an ecosystem out there of like different people doing different things, and there isn't just everybody expecting to be unified and necessarily in what they're doing. I mean, it has benefits and drawbacks. We don't have as unified of a community, so we can't share code quite as well. But I think it's a really great thing to, at least in these early stages, to have this kind of like bubbling ecosystem to see like what winds up sticking.
Yeah, I only started playing with React even not too long ago, so I'm really liking it so far. I'm very familiar with Angular, and it's very different than Angular. So it's a pretty cool project. And Flux, when I saw that, I was like, wow, this is really interesting. We had to get you on.
Yeah, a huge part of the benefit is the learning curve, right? The learning curve for Angular is really steep, and the benefits to your application are in question because there are performance problems, and then in the end you have all this two-way data binding going on, and it can be very difficult to reason about what is happening in a complex Angular application. Angular has many strengths that are totally awesome, and I'm not trying to diss Angular per se, but what we found is that developers here that are new to Facebook, they ramp up with React and Flux like super fast, and they're off and running and building their own Flux projects like really soon. And so I think that's another benefit is that like, we all work at companies or places where we may be working with different team members from time to time. And to be able to bring a new team member in and say like, this is how we build this, and have them be able to understand it in like a day or two is really powerful, and like, helps with the efficiency of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, definitely agreed. I had a great experience with that, being able to ramp someone up and hand something off very quickly.
Yeah, I've had that experience a couple of times, like just with interns here at Facebook. Was able to get them off and running and like writing Flux applications like top to bottom within a very short amount of time. So it's been great.
It seems like I'm used to the data binding, but when I first saw Angular even, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much DOM stuff. It's just like I'm mixing all of my data inside the DOM. This is crazy. And now I've been moving with React too, and React is a totally different mindset for me to build these applications. But it is true. The code is very easy to follow, and I like that.
Yeah, yeah, because at the end of the day, I mean, it's nice when you can get something built fast, and and there's that wonderful feeling in working with React and Flux that I mentioned earlier. It's like I know where I am at any given moment. Like I got that feeling. Remember when I started building with Rails? I kind of felt the same way a little bit. It's like this is a really comfortable development environment. Well, it turns out like in really big Rails applications, things get a little crazy, right?
Oh yeah.
But with Flux, I've had that same feeling of like I know where I am, and I know where things belong. I know where things go, and that's a really, really pleasant development environment to be in, I find.
That's good to hear, because React without Flux is awesome for building focused components, but as soon as it gets too big, you get that lost feeling again.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to have Nick talk on a Google Hangout we run monthly, where we go into source code and we talk about what's happening as you go through the source. And he went through React, and it was really only a small part of React, but it was a lot of stuff in 1 hour. So it's a pretty amazing framework.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get tripped up a little bit around like the sort of the functional approach of React, and they think that, for example, that you're not really supposed to like change the props inside of a component, and that you should keep it as stateless as possible, and that that you should try to use the composition as much as possible, and like take parts out of your components, make them smaller by composing different sections into subcomponents. And I think a lot of people get a little tripped up because it is a bit of a paradigm shift. That's the biggest one that I see from the outside, that people like try to do things like directly modify the props on some other component or something like that. And it's difficult for people to sometimes make that switch of like, I'm not like stop setting, like stop using setters, right? Mm-hmm. Like just pass in props through the interface of like the props interface into the children. That's all we're going to do, right? Other than that, let the data flow take care of the rest. That's a big switch, I think, for a lot of people.
I don't know if this is true of your documentation, but I found with a lot of the Angular and documentation stuff, while there's a good information in there, I found that I have to follow certain blogs and find resources elsewhere to find out information like that you may or may not have known. Is there recommended places that you would send people to learn more about Flux, like the details or React, or even like
sure.
different levels of beginner or whatever?
Yeah. So there is obviously there's the React website and the React blog in particular. Those are two great places. There is the Flux. We have a Flux website as well at github.io/Facebook/Flux, I think. And so those are great places. And hopefully the Flux site will get better over time. It's kind of like brand new. But sorry. So, and the other places that I would recommend is the React.js channel on IRC, on Freenode. That's a great place to like ask questions. Another place is the Google group, the React.js Google group, and also Stack Overflow. I mean, I try to monitor Stack Overflow as much as I can around that stuff. But those are, I would say, the main channels that I'm aware of for finding out information.
And is there anything that we should be talking about that we haven't talked about yet, dealing with Flux or React?
Well, I think there's an open question as far as our original topic with web components, and whether or not those two, like Addy was suggesting, can coexist as well as possible.
I really want to try out the experiment of trying to marry together, web components in React and see what the constraints there might be and what the performance hits might be to trying to do that. Because I believe in web components for the long run.
Yeah.
But for right now, they've got still working out kinks and stuff that can help. So it's definitely something to try.
So if people want to contact you or find out more about Flux, what's the best way that they can reach you?
Probably hitting me up on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is @FisherWebDev. So that's FisherWebDev on the end as in Victor. And that's probably the best place to get a hold of me. You can ask questions about Flux there, and I can, we can move it from there into the Google group or something like that, or I can answer them on Twitter if I can. Otherwise, I'll generally try to check in on Freenode on Tuesday afternoons.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure. This is a really great project. I'm looking forward to working with it. So,
cool.
Thanks for coming on.
All right. Thanks a lot. And hey, Nick, thank you too. All right.
Thanks.
See you later.
Take care, guys. This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3Pillar Global. 3Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3Pillar on the Twitters, it's @3PillarGlobal. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you.